involvement at her level. Towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa, which was published last year, proposes that the EU-Africa partnership covers migration, the green transition, digital transformation, peace and governance, and sustainable growth and jobs holistically. And I think this is really important perspective. With regard to financial support, from 2014 to now, the EU has been supporting the AfCFTA through our Pan-African program with more than 74 million euro. Through this funding, the EU is supporting capacity building for the negotiation, ratification, and implementation of the AfCFTA agreement to ensure that African countries and intra-African trade can benefit from the opportunities that the agreement will provide. The EU-FTA area on three fronts. First, we are involved in and supporting the ongoing negotiations. Secondly, we are also supporting the preparations for the phase 2 and phase 3 of the negotiations. And we are also involved and supporting the activities for implementation in African countries and regions. I heard a lot of you already talking about policy implementation, so that would also be interesting from our perspective. Another main reason of the European Union commitment in this ambitious project is that building a common market as ultimate goal of the AfCFTA is very close to the European Union's heart. We've been down a similar road before. We're still on that road. We built a free trade area, a customs union, and a single market, making these past, or that was a process actually of 65 years, the longest period of economic growth and prosperity in our continent's history. I very often make the link between the importance of economic integration and a sustainable and a peaceful continent. But this is why we work hand in hand with Africa in its own continental integration process. In that respect, the EU's financial support is backed up by significant technical support. The European Commission is eager to reinforce our offer of sharing expertise in economic integration. We are also ready to develop jointly with the African Union Commission and the AfCFTA Secretariat in Ghana the integrated and coherent support needed for effective implementation of the AfCFTA at continental, at regional, and at national level. We also believe that the European Union trade negotiations with African partners has helped and supported to build national, regional, and continental to deliver results in negotiating the AfCFTA so far, actually in record time. On that subject, my colleague from DG Trade, EU colleague, will give more insights during the specific panel discussion. But allow me to take this opportunity really to stress that the EU strongly believe that in particular, rules of a region, the regional preference clause, and the developmental approach, which are part of the economic partnership agreements, are helpful for African industrialization, developing regional continental value chains, and finally to strengthen Africa's regional economic communities as the important building blocks of the continental integration agenda. To conclude, I'm happy to inform you that the EU, I hope you can hear from the strong support I'm expressing, will continue to be a strong supporter of the African economic integration agenda, and in particular, the AfCFTA. This will be one of the main pillars of our new Global Europe multi-annual program that goes from 2021 up to 2027, which is the next 7 years. And finally, obviously, I would like to thank UNECA for this initiative and for other partners, universities in Canada, and wish all of you a fruitful and very productive discussion. I'll be very keen and interested in receiving the recommendations of the discussions. So thank you very much, and full support to the discussions you're going to have over the next days. Thank you very much.
Thank you kindly, Ambassador. We now turn to Professor Melaku Desta from UNECA. And Professor Desta, are you there? He's going to say a few words. The title of Implementing the AfCFTA Agreement in a World of Multi-Layered Economic Governance, Unpacking the Challenges of Side Deals in the Next Phase of African Integration. Over to you, Professor Desta.
Thank you very much, moderator. Let me start by saying that I'm not with the ECA any longer. I'm an academic, so that I think is important. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to all of you from Addis. I have a power problem here, so if I'm cut off in the middle of my talk, please understand where I am, and hopefully I'll get back to you later on. I feel honored to be part of this round table and grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this important question. I will organize my remarks in three parts. I'll start with a brief background about the AfCFTA agreement as I see it. I will then identify and describe the type of challenges that I see that come out of what I call side deals concluded by African countries with non-African partners and how they can be managed. And then I will conclude with a few thoughts. My presentation today builds on a number of research papers I have co-authored with colleagues over the past couple of years, to all of whom I'm grateful, but of course the usual disclaimer applied that the views I express here are exclusively my own, and I talk here with the freedom available to the academic. So if I'm if I am going to be slightly controversial, it's because I would like to provoke some thoughts and some honest discussions in the spirit of the roundtable itself, as Dr. Kavinji earlier indicated. So to start with the background, for me, I look at the AfCFTA as a process, the journey, but also other ways station on that long journey. The journey, the CFTA project started long ago on a very bumpy road. It still has a long way to go on that road to reach this destination, which is the continental common market. And as travelers on that road, African countries have strayed at times, sometimes we lost their ways, often because of a lack of resolve in their commitments to agreed goals, but also sometimes because of unhelpful inducements and temptations from outside to change course, making arrival at the destination unnecessarily long and difficult. The start of that journey dates back to the colonial days, but it was the formation of the OAU in 1963 that provided the institutional platform for coordination of that effort. Yet, in those early days, economic cooperation was perceived more as a means to achieve political ends than as an end in itself. And it was only, especially since the 1979 Monrovia Summit, that we saw a concerted effort towards economic integration for its own sake. And then notable in that period are the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, which after about a decade gave birth to the famous Treaty of June 1991, the Abuja Treaty on the establishment of the African Economic Community. The treaty, the Abuja Treaty, is famous for laying down a very detailed 34-year program of integration in legally binding language, which aimed to establish the community using regional economic communities as the building blocks. And this is a very important point to keep in mind while talking about side deals today, because the type of side deals we are talking about affect not just the AfCFTA project, but also the regional or sub-regional integration programs around the regional economic communities as well. And the Abuja program did not deliver on its promises in full, again, mainly because member countries created too many regional economic communities, and they joined more than one regional economic community at a time. And the image I often use to describe this is something that evokes that of a person attempting to board more than one train at the same time in order to travel to a particular destination, which is an obvious impossibility. It was after all the attempts that negotiations for the AfCFTA agreement were launched in 2015, and it took barely 2 years to negotiate such a landmark agreement, which was adopted in March 2018, as we mentioned already. The entry into force of that agreement at such record time in May 2019 represents a bright spot in African history recently. However, as also mentioned by my previous speakers, entry into force of the agreement is only a necessary condition for success in realizing the ambition of creating a single market. It is not sufficient in itself. The key to success lies with implementation of the agreement to its letter and spirit, and that this is an area in which Africa's record is far from encouraging. And when it comes to side deals, it's as if Africa's internal implementation challenges are not enough, that we also have to grapple with a host of external challenges. For most among them is the challenge of what I call here side deals, the bilateral trade agreements between African countries, individually or in small groups on the one hand, and non-African countries or regions on the other. It's a source of concern that many African countries are yielding to external pressure in this area, thereby potentially derailing the AfCFTA objective to move the continent from a free trade area to a customs union and a single market. While there are many examples here, such as free trade agreements negotiated with China, India, and the like, I will take the economic partnership agreements with the European Union and potential free trade agreements that are in the making between individual African countries and the United States of America for the post-AGOA period, to which I will come. I chose these two for rather obvious reasons. They are important players on the global economic scene, but also they are important trading partners for Africa, the ambassador just indicated, for the EU, for example. To start with the economic partnership agreements, clearly the EU is by far Africa's most important trading partner. And it's not by accident, nor can it be explained by history and geography alone. Deliberate policy choices in the post-colonial period have played an important role. Africa-EU trade relations have been underpinned by special arrangements for over half a century now. A key instrument has been the European policy of preferential non-reciprocal market access towards Africa that remained in place since the Lomé I agreement between the EU and the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific countries in 1975 until the end of the trade chapter of the Cotonou agreement at the end of December 2007. The day this non-reciprocal preferential trade regime came to an end was also the day the transition period for the conclusion of bi-regional economic partnership agreements ended. And then at that point, it left a patchwork of often bilateral free trade area type agreements, mostly between individual African countries on one side and the EU on the other. EPAs have impeded regional integration in Africa by providing perverse incentives to African countries to go back on their regional commitments. To mention just a few examples, the EU provides duty-free and quota-free market access for least developed countries under the Everything But Arms Law of 2001, while developing, i.e. non-LDC African countries have had to negotiate economic partnership agreements with reciprocal market access commitments. Considering that virtually all regional economic communities in Africa are made up of a mix of LDCs and developing countries, the regional economic communities have been unable to forge a common position vis-à-vis the EU in these EPA negotiations. And this has left several developing, i.e. non-LDC African countries with signing bilateral EPAs with the EU as an only option, even where their commitments with their respective regional economic communities require them to act otherwise. While Africa's trade with the EU has been substantial, intra-Africa trade had remained rather low. Importantly, however, Africa's exports to the rest of the world are still dominated by primary commodities and it's imported by value-added manufacturers, while intra-Africa trade is increasingly made up of industrial products. This is where the promise of the AfCFTA comes in, and where I believe the EU also needs to adapt its trade policy towards Africa in line with these common developments on the continent. This, in practice, would mean, among others, that the AfCFTA is promising to overcome the old, outdated, and damaging division of Africa into Mediterranean Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. To this extent, one would hope that the EU would also move away from the old and outdated division of Africa and start dealing with Africa as one. And in trade terms, this would, for example, entail abolishing the association agreements for North Africa and the EPS for the rest of Africa, and negotiating a bi-regional continent-to-continent or union-to-union free trade agreement with the whole of Africa acting as one. It's also important that the EU realizes leadership role in this field, putting Africa in a difficult position with the other trading partners. Once Africa has agreed to some specific commitments with the European Union, it cannot then go and offer less favorable terms to its other trading partners. For example, and I will elaborate further down, the US has long used the reciprocal nature of economic partnership agreements as a potent argument as to why they would not continue with the unilateral preferences of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The UK is already replicating the EPS all across Africa. And I think this is important to note that in the field of trade policy, where the EU goes, others follow. We have to make sure that the path charted by the EU does not damage Africa's interests. Turning to the US-Africa relations post-AGOA, the picture that emerges is also just as concerning. In trade parlance, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is an act of the US Congress that provides unilateral, i.e. non-reciprocal preferential, essentially duty-free access to the US market for qualifying goods originating in eligible African countries south of the Sahara. Because the beneficiary African countries are not required to give comparable duty-free treatment to similar goods coming to their markets from the United States, AGOA is typical of the so-called unilateral non-reciprocal preferential schemes. The comparable instrument in Europe would be, as I mentioned earlier, the European Union's Everything But Arms Law of 2001, which grants duty-free access to the EU single market for all products except arms originating from least developed countries. While there are many similarities between AGOA and the EBS schemes, they differ in one important respect. While AGOA preferences apply on a geographical basis, i.e. only to African countries south of the Sahara, EBA, the Everything But Arms preference, apply to on developmental considerations based on the UN classification of countries as least developed countries, of which 33 are in Africa today. By discriminating in favor of their respective groups of beneficiary countries to the exclusion of others, both the EBA and AGOA schemes would in principle be in breach of WTO rules on non-discrimination. However, as a preferential arrangement applying to all least developed countries, the EBA qualifies as a lawful exception from the MF and the most favored nation principle as provided for in the enabling clause of 1979 under the WTO law. On the other hand, because AGOA is based on geography rather than level of development, it does not qualify as a legitimate exception under any general WTO rule or decision. Instead, it has been operating within the law because of a time-limited waiver that was granted by the WTO General Council on 13 November 2015. This waiver comes to an end on 30 September 2025, which is also the scheduled date for the termination of AGOA itself. This exception of AGOA's expectation of AGOA's expiry on 30 September 2025 also explains the preparatory discussions that are slowly unfolding between the two sides today, the US and Africa. Like what the EU did in respect of the Lomé-Cotonou agreements at the end of 2007, WTO compatibility is likely to be another reason to phase out AGOA as well. Of course, if the EU then and the US now wanted to keep these preferential schemes in place, the WTO option could provide legal cover for as long as these powers wished to keep it. The real reason, I believe, lies elsewhere. It is notable that the impact of AGOA in improving Africa's exports to the US market is widely regarded as rather marginal. Indeed, a substantial proportion of Africa's exports to the US in 2017, for example, were concentrated in extractive resources, with oil alone accounting for around 65% of US imports from the region under the scheme. Of course, we know that crude oil imports to the US or to many other countries hardly ever attract duties even from non-AGOA beneficiary countries. Moreover, non-oil AGOA exports to the US are so concentrated in just a few countries that the overall picture that emerges for the continent is far from encouraging. Amongst the factors often mentioned for the underutilization of AGOA preferences are lack of productive capacity in AGOA-eligible countries, non-tariff measures affecting market access, such as product safety and health standards, as well as restrictive rules of origin requirements, and seemingly arbitrary country eligibility determinations made annually by the US government, from which no appeal lies, which make the US an unpredictable market for African exporters. Despite its relatively marginal role, however, the termination of AGOA in 2025 is still likely to have a significant impact on Africa's export trade. Regrettably, again, the US seems determined to replace AGOA with a series of bilateral free trade agreements negotiated with individual African countries that are ready and willing to do so. Mind you, despite the fact that Africa is driving on the AfCFTA highway towards a single market, the US is not contemplating, for now at least, an agreement with the whole of Africa acting as one. In other words, just like the EU, the US is determined to terminate the unilateral AGOA and replace it with a patchwork of reciprocal free trade agreements that it wishes to negotiate with individual African countries. This poses a number of concerns for the African side, including, for example, once again, it undermines the AfCFTA objective to progressively establish a single African market as recognized in Article 3A of the agreement. It encourages African countries to act contrary to several decisions taken by the AU Assembly itself to engage external partners as one bloc speaking with one voice, thereby risking undermining the long-held vision and ambition for Africa to act collectively to promote its common interests and positions in the international arena. Finally, it unnecessarily complicates Africa's integration agenda, not just at the continental level, but even sub-regional. In conclusion, for all the above reasons and more, I call on African countries to resist the temptation to go it alone and negotiate side deals that are likely to be damaging to their own interests and the interests of the continent at large over the long term. However, these countries cannot be expected to adopt and maintain such positions in the face of powerful trading partners withdrawing preferential market access schemes without replacing them with proportionate arrangements. At this stage, then, our calls must also go to the EU and the US to pause and reconsider their trade policy strategies towards Africa. They cannot afford to work against Africa's vision to create a single African market. Similar calls to other trading partners, including China, India, and others. An Africa that trades increasingly with itself is likely to be a more peaceful, stable, prosperous, and responsible player in the world. Instead of the recurrent conflict, instability, migration, etc., that have regrettably defined Africa for far too long, arriving Africa will be a beacon of hope and opportunity for citizens and an attractive market for all. The AfCFTA, we must underline, is an instrument for intra-African interdependence, but also a tool for continental independence at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Desta, and my apologies for misidentifying your current affiliation. I believe that we are now going straight into the first session. So I'd invite the chair of the first session, Unpacking and Managing Global Multilateral Trade Regimes, Implications for the Implementation of AfCFTA, to join.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Excellencies. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm properly connected. Okay. So my name is Francis Ikome. I am the Chief of the Regional Integration Section at the Regional Integration and Trade Division at the ECA. It's a wonderful privilege for me to be chairing this session, which, like introduced, I would be focusing on unpacking and managing global multilateral trade regimes, implications for the implementation of the AfCFTA, with a tilted bias on assessing challenges that face the AfCFTA implementation. The earlier speakers have, including the keynote, my colleague Melaku, who presented the keynote address, they have touched and addressed the opportunities and challenges that face the African Continental Free Trade Area. Suffices for me to just indicate that it is common knowledge that Africa is indeed a latecomer. It joined the global trading system late compared to other regions of the world. And as a result, it has been at the receiving end of some of the shortcomings of the system, including high levels of marginalization and lower competitiveness, partly because of the fragmented nature of African markets. So integration has been considered a panacea for Africa's to improve Africa's competitiveness in this system. But even as Africa joined the system late, it is integrated to the system through membership of key global multilateral frameworks such as the WTO, and also indirectly through relations with other blocs, particularly the EU, as has been appropriately highlighted. The advent of the AfCFTA, the AfCFTA therefore comes at a time, enters into an already congested global multilateral system, and therefore presents both opportunities but also critical challenges to the AfCFTA. And that is, those are some of the issues that the panel that has been put together, a very eminent panelists that have been put together, will be trying to unpack and grapple with. The main speaker here would be no one else than Dr. Joy Katagetwa, who is the regional strategic advisor to assist the administrator and director for the Regional Bureau Africa at the United Nations Development Program. All of us know Joy has served as head of the UNCTAD Regional Office for Africa, where she led a delivery of the organization's trade capacity building programs across Africa. She is an international trade development law and policy specialist and has spent well over 16 years shaping development-friendly trade agreements at both the World Organization and the regional context. But more importantly, Joy was one of the architects of the African Continental Free Trade Area, having led technical teams in designing and drafting legal and negotiations instrument for the AfCFTA. So I'm not sure we could get a better person to speak to the theme of this particular session. So Joy, you are welcome. It's been a while I've not seen you. I'm glad to see you again, and you'll be leading us in this conversation. The panel would have as discussants, would have Ms. Annette Simawemba, who is the Deputy Executive Director, Enhanced Integrated Framework, Enhanced Integrated Framework, yeah. Prior to that, she was the Chief Strategy and Results Officer and member of the senior leadership team at Trademark East Africa. She is an international development professional with over 20 years of experience in international trade and development, primarily trade policy formulation, regional integration, trade facilitation, and trade-related capacity building at national and regional levels. Again, you'll see it, this discussant brings a wealth of experience and insights that would really help us unpack the dynamics underpinning the theme of this session. Then we have Ms. Trudy Hetzenberg, Executive Director at TRALAG. She has a special interest in trade-related capacity building, and her research areas include trade and policy issues, regional integration, investment, industrial competition policy. The TRALAC is specialized in developing technical expertise and capacity in governance across Africa. It is committed to, more importantly, it's committed to principles of rules-based governance at national, regional, and international levels. Again, Rudy, given our publications and interventions that we are all familiar with, comes with a wealth of knowledge when it comes to rules-based governance of the international trading system. And then we have Professor Babatunde Fagbeyobi, who is of the University of South Africa. Who uses a multidisciplinary research lens in addressing critical issues of regional integration and development in Africa. His interests include the African Union, transnational policy development, good governance, and democratization in Africa, critical approaches to international law, and comparative regionalism. He is the editor-in-chief of the Southern African Public Law Journal. Again, we have someone who is bringing important legal background to, again, speak to the theme. And finally, we, last but not the least, would have Ambassador Okupane Moniani, who is the permanent representative of Lesotho to the UN. Ambassador Muyani holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Sociology from the University of Botswana. That's UBLS at the University of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and a banking degree from Delphi University in the United States. Prior to his appointment, he held multiple positions in the banking and financial and textile sectors. More importantly, Ambassador Muyani has served as coordinator of the African group on WTO matters. So we have a country perspective with a very seasoned practitioner. So those are that's the composition of the panel. And without taking much of your time again, I would want to kindly request Joy to take the floor. Joy, over to you. You are my friend, but I will be very ruthless with time. So you have exactly 20 minutes. Over.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good morning to you all from New York. Excellencies, distinguished representatives of the academia, dear friends in Addis. It is such a pleasure to be with you today to talk about a critical issue that is at the heart of implementation of the AfCFTA. It is a warm space in which I am today amongst many friends, many colleagues for whom I have a lot of respect. And in fact, in the past, we've spent some time trying to interrogate this particular question. How do relations with third countries impact on the possibility of the AfCFTA to see the light of day? Professor Desta Melaku, Dr. David Luke, Dr. Stephen Karingi, you would recall our Nairobi sessions, our Nairobi drafting sessions, where we tried to tease out all of these issues. And so here we are, 4 months after start of trading, interrogating a question that was at the heart of the drafting and thinking process. And so today I'd like to make 3 points that I think will help to frame this conversation. Professor Melaku gave us a background. So in my 3 points, I'd like to say, what do we do with the complexity of the MFN clause in the AfCFTA? Because it's at the heart in an FTA of relations with third countries. We have what we have. How do we navigate the space going forward? And then the final reflections will be around, what if we succeed? What then? So let's go back to the MFN clause. You see, a trade agreement like the AfCFTA is really about giving the best treatment you have between and amongst certain countries, preferential treatment at the goal of increasing trade between and amongst those countries. It is naturally a group, and that's why we call it preferential treatment. And therefore, in an FTA, the distinction between who is in the group and who is outside of the group, third countries, is often defined by an MFN clause, most favored nation clause. And an MFN clause in an FTA space takes on a slightly different role than the one in the multilateral context. The MFN clause in the FTA is really structured around creating this idea that the FTA would be the fulcrum of attention as countries try to liberalize and engage in preferential treatment between and amongst themselves. It does this by ensuring that all treatment better than what is given in this group must be given immediately and conditionally to the members of the group. In a sense, therefore, the members of the group, as they seek to strike trade deals with others, side deals, as Professor Melaku called them, the MFN clause in an FTA requires them immediately and unconditionally to give that to the members of the group. And so it's a careful question as to how far you want to go with others. Now, in order for an MFN clause to do that effectively in an FTA, it must be crafted in a certain way. That is why many of those MFN clauses in RTAs try to speak to large trading partners. Whatever you do with larger trading partners, you must give immediately and unconditionally to us in this group. Large trading partners is important as a reference because it captures the relations that Professor Melaku was talking about at the start, the larger trading partners. Now, remembering that the FTA is not a customs union, and therefore de facto you do not have the situation of a common external tariff. The MFN clause is the best tool you have at that level of integration to try and capture the best, to create some harmony, to make this the fulcrum, so to speak, as I said. To do that well, there are certain things an MFN clause should, strictly speaking, try to avoid. One of them is the notion of reciprocity, the conditional access on reciprocity. That when you strike an MFN clause, in order to get that treatment, you must reciprocate. Because what it means in practice is that if indeed this group, one of them gave better treatment to a third party, if the group wants to have such treatment, it must by condition, by necessary condition, to have access to such treatment, engage in a negotiation with that member within the group so that they can land on what the reciprocity means in that context. Bringing this down to the AfCFTA, we have an MFN clause in the AfCFTA that was a careful balance of many considerations that landed at trying to understand what to do with relations that have taken place with third parties prior to the AfCFTA and conditioning reciprocity to that, but also with conditions of access that will happen post AfCFTA and requiring that too to have reciprocity. This is the qualitative difference in terms of what we have in the AfCFTA. It means, therefore, that the members of this group, the AfCFTA, cannot say, for example, should Kenya strike a deal with the US, that you're breaching our MFN obligation, because the requirement for Kenya to give you treatment no less favorable in that context, you're welcome to have that treatment, but let's sit down at the table and let's negotiate this question of reciprocity. So that is what we have. That's why I said we have a complex MFN clause. Now, what do we do with this MFN clause? How do we navigate? I hope that in my initial reflections, you have at least landed in the space in which I am in terms of understanding that there is indeed a complexity. So how do we navigate? And this will be the second generation of the ideas I'd like to share today. One is how to navigate a situation where de facto countries in the AfCFTA are allowed to strike side deals. They're allowed to go as far as they want. It's not a customs union. They're allowed to do that. You have an MFN clause, but to get it, you must reciprocate to get that better treatment. So if we have 90% in the AfCFTA, if other countries get 95, that difference, especially if it's tariff lines of interest to you, you must negotiate reciprocity. How do we navigate? I'd like to make 4 points. One is to use the reality of schedules and offering tariffs, notifications of your offers, to use that as a basis to go as far as possible to that which is left. So that in fact, in practice, de facto, you increase the ambition of the 90 sequencing into another 7, leaving out 3. That you try as far as possible to catch up with the acquis, because remember, the AfCFTA was supposed to be built on the acquis. The acquis itself, in some ways, is beyond the 90%. And so strictly speaking, it would not be a contradiction in terms of the access these countries are giving, and would be a quicker way to get, in a sense, also to where we're going. If the practice of scheduling tariff offers and services, schedules of specific commitments and services caught up. Because ultimately what we're doing here at the heart of this question is the race to what's left out of the sequencing that we agreed to in the AfCFTA. So what if member states, what if states parties were a bit more ambitious in how they issue their offers? Because then you reduce the space of this contestation of what is treatment no less favorable. You catch up with the acquis in the regs, and then you really go back to the central questions of how do we actually get the products going. The second point I'd like to raise as a navigation question is this idea of review. Within 5 years, I think there was a clause in the AfCFTA that is around, in 5 years, we shall review the operationalization of the agreement. We'll take stock, see how this thing is going. At that point, in my view, is an occasion to really say, what is the AfCFTA working like for purposes of third countries? Knowing well that we're not yet at 55. So even as we preoccupy ourselves with the 34, 36 that have ratified, the real question might actually be about those that haven't. And the reality that third countries can strike deals with these non-AfCFTA members, and because of the REC reality, you establish commercial presence, you start to produce made in that country, naturally by virtue of the REC or the porous borders, you have access. So at the review stage, I think there's time for that sort of consideration. Could this reciprocity thing be rethought? Secondly, could we ramp up in parallel the numbers of ratifications? Because then you have a truly one Africa market. The third point I'd like to say in this context is a political decision around staying this commencement of negotiations with third parties. It is not legally binding, but at the same time, it runs off the same winds that were in the sail of the AfCFTA, the political winds that have pushed the AfCFTA to where it is. So what if you had a political discussion, agreement, that as we go into these arrangements with third countries, let us make sure they're not in contradiction with the AfCFTA. But in any case, let's get a structure that gets us to start thinking about customs union as soon as possible, while staying and discussing the commencement, staying being a legal term, delaying the starting of these conversations so that there's unity. And in that space, knowing that indeed the third countries are present on the continent, they constitute the largest footprint of FDI. Now that they're present, how do we get a good marriage between investment and trade? That you use these relations for these third countries to indeed come and establish on the continent, bring technology, bring skills, bring capital, produce those products, employ African people, give them the opportunity for this to really be an inclusive arrangement as we try to work out and think through how it is that we can do the continent to continent that Prof spoke about. So what if we did all of that and we're successful? Then I'd like to go to my last ideas. Would still be at this point that intra-African trade is 16, 18% at most. Would still be at that point that it is still the most promising one because in there you have value added. But how do we move from 16, 18% and build on that momentum that we see of 20% more technology content, of about 48, Stephen, you used to do these assessments, 48, 50% more value added, manufacturers type. How do we go there more? And I'd like to leave you with this thought, that these ideas were thought about already. They're in the action plan to boosting intra-African trade. We go back to BIAT, because in BIAT, you have those 7 clusters. You have trade policy, you have trade information, you have trade facilitation, you have factor market integration, you have productive capacities, you have trade-related infrastructure, you have trade finance. It is time that we had a serious conversation about a trade capacity building model for Africa. It is not sufficient to talk about what the rights and the obligations are. It is not sufficient. Rather, we should design a new technical assistance capacity building model that is focused on utilization. So you go to the ground, you understand what the women are exporting, you understand their challenges, you understand what the youth-owned enterprises are trying to take cross-border, and you target serious programs there around scale, around standards, around facilitation across the borders, but you focus on the products and on the services so that we can indeed have that made in Africa revolution. Once we have that, complemented with investment that also allows for scale, complemented with a practical reality that we've gone far in the scheduling and therefore really catching up with this a key question, complemented with the start of a conversation around a customs union, because then we can talk about the policy for a policy towards third countries determined by a common external tariff, then we'll be in a better place. All to say, there's a complexity in the MFN clause. Not all is lost. We can navigate through certain ways, but even if we succeed in that, the crux of AfCFTA is about utilization, and utilization is about the products and the services and the ideas of a Made in Africa revolution. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joy, and as expected, very provocative indeed, and quite some deep insights. I would not try to sum up because you did the summation at the end of your presentation. Just to say 3 key issues: the complexity of the MFN clause, but that it is not a crisis. We should not panic. It is possible to be navigated, and we need to navigate it carefully. But then you challenge us that what if we succeed? What happens? And you are talking about the issue of being able to implement and capacitate using, you took us back to BIAT, which is a framework that we sometimes forget at our own peril. So thanks very much. I would not try to speak too much about what you've done. Let me just give the floor to the next speaker, to the discussants. The first discussant we have is actually Ms. Annette Semuemba, Deputy Director, Enhanced Integration Framework. Ms. Annette, please, if you are there, could you kindly take the floor? I can see you on the screen, so over to you. Welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you very much, Dr. Joy, for your thought-provoking, very, very insightful presentation. You threw me off track. I lost everything that I had prepared because I was intently listening to you. And you really raised a number of issues that are critical, that are key. I will speak, I'll start with a disclaimer. I speak from a practitioner's point of view, so I won't be able to discuss the technical aspects of the issues that you've presented around the MFN clause, although I understand them, but I'd prefer coming from a program that supports least developed countries to build institutional and policy capacity support to integrate into the global economy. So I'll speak from that perspective. And as you spoke, Joy, I listened to the complexities and I thought about countries that will struggle to understand these issues. Countries that lack the institutional capacity and the technical capacity. And some of the solutions that you provided were the need, for instance, to negotiate. But to what extent do countries understand these issues? And to what extent are they able to negotiate to be able to get the best deals out of these negotiations? For me, that's a critical issue. And speaking from the LDCs, as the EIF, we're trying to engage, and we see the base that we are starting from as being very low in many of the countries, to a point where issues such as what you just presented are very important, but they are simply not being discussed. There's no engagement at the country level to start to think about how to benefit most, especially when the negotiation has to happen with the other countries that will be benefiting, having negotiated with third countries. There's the issue that you raised on unpacking and taking advantage of the frameworks that we have in place. And one of the points that I thought about as I was preparing was the need for a monitoring framework. And there must be monitoring frameworks in place already, but the tendency usually is to trigger the monitoring at the end rather than as part of the process now. By now, with the countries that are already in the implementation phase, those monitoring frameworks should already be in place. Monitoring frameworks that are overarching, that are looking at the various parameters, and you talked about the 7 key issues, trying to understand progress, the winners, the losers, the challenges as they evolve, the extent to which the private sector is involved, the civil society. You talked about women involvement, the youth. All these are issues that are very important. But what frameworks are we using for monitoring purposes? And again, the EIF is supporting or is in position to support those initiatives around monitoring. If you did mention the importance of a tier program that is all encompassing, and I think these are areas that we could influence. Another point arising from your presentation, Joy, is you did speak about staying commencement of negotiations, and to my mind, issues around sovereignty remain. Issues around sovereignty, issues around silent competition among countries. We don't have, we have many economic complementarities and competition at the same time. So the extent to which countries will work together towards a common aim, or the extent to which they will take divergent paths just so that they can be ahead of the of each other. And I think that's an issue we also need to try and see how to engage on. It's a challenge that remains, and maybe one that is not discussed as frequently. We all know that there are low levels of export complementarity, and enhancing this complementarity between these countries has the potential to unlock higher levels of integration and the emergence of regional value chains that the investment you talked about could be invested into. But if we remain with this competition, if we remain with this sovereignty umbrella, above each of the different countries, the challenge will still remain. We are taking some steps as the EIF to see how we can address some of these issues. For instance, we're working with the private sector in West Africa. We have a program working with the Global Shea Alliance. We all know the importance of the shea nut sector and products from the shea nut. So working with countries to develop this as an African brand, to develop brands that are African from the shea nut. So initiatives such as that could be pilot processes to help us understand better what can work, what is not able to work, and what it is that we can do to continue to work together as countries, as nations, and to take away some of these complex issues. So it was really an insightful, very insightful presentation, Joy. It really got me thinking, and I'm sure it got a lot of the participants thinking, including, of course, what we heard from the keynote address in the opening session. And perhaps I'll stop here. Francis, back to you. I hope those 3 points that I raised do make sense and can provoke further thoughts in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annette. The points you made are indeed very pertinent, and they deepen what Joy put on the table, as well as the keynote address and earlier interventions. Highly appreciated. You drew attention particularly to issues of sovereignty and unnecessary competition, and urged kind of admonished that the AfCFTA would succeed if complementarities are leveraged as opposed to competing unnecessarily. So those are very important points. We also take note of the work that the kind of support that the institution you work in can provide in advancing some of these interventions you've put on the table. So highly appreciated. I'm sure during the course of the meeting, these issues would be further engaged. Let me now move to the third discussant, who is no one else than Trudy, a good friend of the ECA. Trudy, I see you are on the platform. Good to see you again, and please, you have the floor. Take care.
Thank you so much, Francis. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to join you for this extremely important discussion. We've had some really insightful contributions, so I was really thinking about what to contribute. And Annette, I'm in the same position. Some of my notes have now been overtaken by far more eloquent expositions. But I would like to go back to Stephen's question when he made his introductory remarks, and he asked, are bilaterals with global partners a threat to the AfCFTA? And I would say we need to think along two tracks here. First of all, protecting the integrity of this ambitious trade integration and development initiative among the member states of the African Union. Secondly, we need to think about the prospects for the AfCFTA to be the vehicle for us to achieve the broader trade, industrialization, and development objectives that are articulated within the AfCFTA. Joy has very eloquently brought our attention to Article 18, the MFN clause focusing on continental preferences. And when it comes to taking a look at the relationship between African countries and global trade partners, we need to keep in mind that some trade agreements with global partners exist already. Most of those are with our traditional partners, focusing in particular on the European Union. There are agreements emerging with new partners, our new friends in the global trade space, China, India, for example. And then we really are looking at a very important step related to, for example, the renewal, the recalibration of relationships that exist under non-reciprocal preferential arrangements, such as everything but arms, the GSP array of arrangements, and of course AGOA, as Joy and Annette have reminded us. So there are a number of tracks that we have to keep in mind. I think importantly, if we do an analysis of existing agreements with our global trade partners, we are sometimes kinder in terms of traditional market access, for example, tariff liberalization to our global partners than we are to one another. So if we take a look at what exists within our existing regional economic communities, sometimes we have offered actually lower tariffs to our global trade partners. I think that's really important to keep in mind. But let's think a minute about the integrity of the AfCFTA and the existing partnerships, trade agreements with global partners. Here, of course, instruments such as the rules of origin become absolutely critical to ensuring that we guard against transshipment trade deflection. And this brings us, it's an entry point, a segue into a discussion not only about our relationship with third parties and the particular manifestations of those relationships, but how those relationships relate to the challenges at home. And a number of our speakers, including Professor Desta, have focused our attention on the implementation challenges. So when it comes to assuring the integrity of the AfCFTA as it exists now, given the status of global trade agreements, global partnerships that exist, yes, rules of origin are important, but I would say we need to go further. We need to be looking at the broad compact of the AfCFTA. And if we're thinking only in terms of trade and goods at this stage, then there are 4 annexes which relate to trade facilitation: customs and border management, customs cooperation, transit, and under the trade facilitation annex, for example, practical programs. And I really want to thank Annette for raising the practical agenda. Practical programs such as the Authorized Economic Operator Program, which is noted. Now, if we are to take our own integration initiative, the AfCFTA, seriously, colleagues, this has to be done with intent, with purpose, with dedication. And it means that we have to take a look at the synergies between that agenda and what we've committed in the World Trade Organization under the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and of course, the building blocks of the AfCFTA that are the existing regional economic communities. We're not starting from scratch, and I think that's particularly important. Now, if we move our attention to the prospects, the future potential that the AfCFTA holds for us on the continent, the practical reality is, at this stage, the AfCFTA is a free trade agreement. And this is recognized in this member state-driven initiative clearly, that we retain policy space to engage with third parties. But the terms and conditions on which we engage, we find in Article 18. And I think that's extremely important to have a look at very, very carefully. The practical reality is that about 80 or even more % of our trade as a continent is still with global trade partners. If we look at investment, sources of foreign direct investment, then of course global sources predominate on the African continent. And these are therefore potentially so important for us to achieve our own objectives of the AfCFTA on the continent, to boost intra-Africa trade. But as a prior condition, we need to be boosting our productive capacity, diversifying and expanding our capacity, not only to produce industrial goods, but to produce agricultural products and also tradable services. So this complexity that Joy referred to is a reality. How do we manage what is an extremely ambitious program to the benefit of all the member states, all the state parties that have to date ratified the agreement, but hopefully we will get to full membership of the African Union. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. So a very realistic approach that we need to take at this stage is to examine what the global partnerships can do to assist us to support achieving the objectives of the AfCFTA. And very importantly, for each state party to achieve its national development objectives. Colleagues, we cannot forget that we are dealing with an integration initiative of a large number of diverse partners. Diversity manifests in terms of economic size, levels of development, orientation, trade, investment relationships. So therefore, each each state party will have its own national development agenda. And we have not got to the stage where we reach the necessary compromise to form a customs union. Equally, we have not reached a point where we are on the same page as far as the objectives for example, financial services sector development or transport sector development are concerned. This is work in progress. So how do we manage the complexity of furthering our national development objectives, balancing that with the sub-regional objectives which continue, because the RECs and their trading arrangements will continue to exist at least for the foreseeable future, with the continental development objectives. How do we leverage global partnerships? And I would say that we need to be aware that there could be a threat. However, there is also significant opportunity that we should not miss out on. And herein lies what should be on the agenda as we negotiate with global trade partners. If we are going to be taking a look at a rather narrowly focused agenda on trade in goods, for example, I think we're missing the opportunities. So let's take a look at what a partnership agreement with global partners could look like that is in our interest. And here we should be shaping that agenda. We should be the demanders for a particular scope of agreement to be negotiated. But that requires a lot of an analytical work, a lot of introspection, a lot of clarity about our development objectives and what can be achieved at national level within our regional economic communities, which exist in terms of their own legal instruments, their institutions, their own very comprehensive and in many cases very advanced agendas. That will continue. Let's build on that, let's leverage that. And let's then take a look at where we stand with the AfCFTA. And I'm particularly interested in phase 2 and phase 3 negotiating issues. Investment, competition policy, intellectual property, and digital trade, e-commerce as it stands now, and the protocol on women and youth. I think this, together with issues such as sustainability, have to define our broad trade agenda, our broad trade and development agenda going forward. And we have to know what we can achieve in terms of those global partnerships that will support our own development agenda. Thanks very much, Francis.
Thanks very much, Trudy, for being, as always, giving insights and coming with perspectives that are quite unique and constructive. Highly appreciated. I just want to at least repeat your call for Africa to be engaging third parties with a lens that goes beyond trade. We shouldn't, the continent should not limit itself to trade. And you've also underscored the importance rather of phase 2 issues of investment, you spoke about diversification and value addition, because if Africa does not diversify, if Africa does not produce, then it would not have much to trade. You admonished the continent to be able to set the agenda for its engagement with external actors. So very, very important points that complement what Joy and Annette and other speakers have said. Highly appreciated. Let me then move to the other speaker, Professor Babatunde Fagbayogbo. Sorry if I've slaughtered your name. I should be able to pronounce this name as an Ibadan product, but my apologies. So over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. So it's Babatunde Fagbayogbo. Yes, thank you to the for the platform, and also like the previous speakers, at least and previous discussants, I've also been thrown off a bit by Dr. Joy's eloquent presentation, and I had to quickly rearrange my thoughts while I was listening to the rest. My approach, or where I come in terms of understanding the complexities of global partnerships, or partnerships with third parties, I start from the position of having a serious introspective, introspective approach to understanding, because if we are not, if we do not take our internal issues seriously, then it becomes very difficult for us to engage with third parties, with external parties. And I think that introspective engagement, introspective analysis is very, very, very important as we discuss issues around, AfCFTA's implementation. For me, my thoughts are gathered around three pillars, of which the first is the ideational pillar, the second is the institutional, and the third is what I call the self-restraining measures, which deals with democratic and human right, adherence to democratic and human right policies and issues in member states. And many of these issues have been touched upon by the previous speakers. I think the first point is, for me, is more around the idea of, the ideational underpinnings of AfCFTA, of, how we approach this as a continent. And I think one of the things that have been missing, one of the key issues missing in AfCFTA, is the fact that there's been, among technocrats, even amongst scholars, there's been this kind of, kind of acceptance of a one-way track in terms of ideas, so one-way track in terms of a neoliberal approach to AfCFTA, so which I call the triumph of neoliberalism, and which started even from the establishment of the African Union. So there's been this one-way kind of approach to it. Now, the question is, are we looking at, are we having a multifaceted kind of approach to understanding that we could have many ideas, and we could also develop our own kind of ideas and approaches as a continent, and also, kind of a more contextual approach that looks at the practices on the continent in the way we approach trade issues, in the politics, even underlining our engagement with all of these things, and also the extent to which even our indigenous knowledge systems actually could be co-opted, so to speak, in kind of advancing the agenda of trade integration on this continent. I think it's a very important thing to look at, and to understand that, we have, there's no, as the popular African proverb says, no one road leads to the market. There will be many ways, many roads leading to the market, and of which to the market of ideas and things along those lines in terms of AfCFTA. And I think, and that takes me to the second issue, which is also very, very important, which I call the institutional approach to it, and the extent to which powers to which our institutions are empowered, the supranational competence of the institutions that would be overseeing the implementation of AfCFTA. We're beginning to see, or it's been the practice, I mean, it's actually the practice that, member states are very, very, very reluctant to transfer powers to the African Union and many of the bodies in the African Union. And the state-centric approach to regionalism is actually stifling and ensures that member states continue, to engage in practices and to work around weak institutional approaches, at least transnational institutions that has the capacity or should have the capacity to oversee this implementation. And there's also been, still under the institutional approach, there's been so much, I think there's been this one-way track or this excessive focus on the technocratic competence of agencies such as the AfCFTA Secretariat and the Department of Trade, and also at the national level. But there needs to also be a more serious approach to, or a more serious consideration of other institutions that could assist in the implementation. So I think of Pan-African Parliament, for example, of granting more powers to the Pan-African Parliament in a way in which it is also able to contribute meaningfully. As it is now, it cannot make binding laws. It's more of a consultative agency, and there's really no seriousness on the part of member states to grant it more powers. That's a very important institution that we cannot afford to neglect in the matrix of the institutional implementation or overseeing of the Continental Free Trade Area. The last, the self-restraint capacity, self-restraint measures. So to what extent are we taking into account, are we understanding that the idea of trade integration cannot be dislocated or dissociated from strict adherence to human rights and democratic practices in member states? If we are to understand, for example, that our people, the masses of Africans, African people, are to benefit from trade integration, then there has to be an understanding that they must also come to it with their rights. To make decisions, to be informed about these issues, and to be able to contribute meaningfully, so that there's a lot of there's some degree of awareness, and also we raise what I would call the foot soldiers, people who would be able to defend regional integration or trade integration from the bottom up. So AfCFTA from below to the top, rather than AfCFTA from top to bottom. And these are of course the involvement of civil society in that sense. So we also see how even the way the AfCFTA, I mean the whole idea of AfCFTA as well, the design gives very little room for civil society to also have a very important say in the decision-making capacity or decision-making plane of the Continental Free Trade Area. So, for example, the dispute settlement body that excludes civil society, it's only about state to state. And we all know in practice, when states have conflicts, the possibility of states even taking conflict to the dispute settlement body is kind of slim, because there will be diplomatic channels or even self-help measures and things like that. And for us to at least from a legal perspective, to have a rich jurisprudence and understanding of Continental Free Trade Area, we need civil society to be able to approach this dispute settlement body in that sense. So those are my brief addition to this enriching debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. Babatunde. You brought in an angle that really enriches the conversation even more. The 3 dimensions you've put on the table, ideational, institutional, and self-restraining pillars. These are indeed are very critical. Africa, I think what you are telling us is that we should look for solutions and answers that will facilitate the implementation of the AfCFTA, first from within, before we start interrogating the outside environment. This is very important, very provocative, that we should go beyond the neoliberal ethos and look at other variable frameworks of making the AfCFTA work. Institutions, and the issue of supranationalism versus intergovernmentalism. You've unpacked this. Institutions need to be empowered and enabled, including our Pan-African Parliament, and many of such institutions, both at the continental and sub-regional level. Then there are issues of self-restraint and the imperative to build from below. I think these are very important and complementary interventions you've made. Thanks very much. With that, let me check if Ambassador Moyane is on the screen. Okay, okay. Glad to have you, Excellency. So over to you.
Thank you so much, moderator. And let me also really express my appreciation and delight in having been invited to make a small contribution to this discourse. And that, of course, my even further delight for the presentation that have already been made, with also an opportunity to meet, albeit virtually, colleagues that we have traveled this road. Some of we have traveled much longer than I have, but that one would like to start really from the intimation of the fact that my dear colleague Joy has made some very elaborate expression of what needs to be navigated and how it needs to be navigated. And in this respect, where one would not like to spoil that very lucid presentation, but rather I would like to dwell more on the, shall I say, the political elements, if that is the right expression of the whole process, the going forward in terms of how we deal with the bilateral arrangement, the multilateral arrangement that exists, and also the emerging arrangements as to whether and how we should go through those. Let me start by saying that the African Continental Free Trade Area is an agreement of member states to maximize inter-African trade, and through it the development of Africa. It is the utilization of arguably the largest and growing own market. On this premise, I would posit that it is distinct from other multilateral arrangements, save for, of course, the technical explanation that Joy has made in respect to this. But it is also distinct in that whereas we are looking at our own market, we are also looking at our own arrangement here to say how do we progress through development, through trade. We on the other arrangement, what has been historically observed is that the most of these multilateral arrangements have been ostensibly trade agreements, but trade agreements between specific countries and Africa, as if Africa was a country. So it has been between countries and the continent, as opposed to country to country, bilateral, or continent to continent, as it would be. Of course, we have an exception here in the context of the EU, as has been explained, and that that one hinges mainly around the reciprocal arrangements between the continent and the EU, but also that we can observe that principally most of the arrangements, as we find like in the US, China, Japan, India, and Russia, they are generic in many respects to country to continent arrangements as opposed to strictly bilateral arrangements as it would be. Of course, you cannot ignore the newer arrangements like the Mauritius, China, and separately India situations. The EU-Africa relationship is structurally different in that it hinges on reciprocity. And that, of course, the presentation given this morning has indicated interesting plans afoot to include promotion of the AfCFTA in the arrangement. But mention has already been made of differentiated treatment that makes it difficult for implementation of African countries that are seeking to unite. For instance, the differentiation that relate to LDCs in situations like, for instance, if I were to go to my own country where we are an LDC and the next country that we have to deal with daily is not an LDC. So some of the arrangements become difficult to implement on the ground. It is an observation that we cannot ignore. But a key observation to this external arrangements is also the limited negotiating capacity on the terms that come with them, which also leads even to a more glaring unilateral determination of what one might call breaches, sanction that follows through non-performance of countries in terms of the very unclear terms. Let's look at AGOA, for instance. It's a unilateral determination of the terms and conditions, unilateral review of eligibility, unilateral review of whether the countries are in fact complying, and a unilateral determination of breaches and sanctions that follows from that particular determination. So they are mostly based on non-trade related and political considerations, which are also loaded with coercive approaches to promoting mainly offensive interests of the external party. The relationships that is this arrangement have produced limited market penetration. They have produced market access, but limited market penetration. For instance, over the many years of AGOA, the over 20 years of AGOA, the Africa is still exporting only 1% of the required imports into the US. But on the other hand, the arrangement has been very effective in advancing the mainly political considerations of the other party. So what can be seen beyond this generalization that I made is that the multilateral trade regimes with Africa will always be of a temporary nature. In the main, they reflect the everlasting power struggles, maybe living up to the image that he who controls Africa controls the world. And that, on the contrary, the Continental Free Trade Area is literally grounded in the continent, and it is in fact a permanent arrangement. This is important, therefore, in terms of how we approach this arrangements, especially the newer ones, The multilateral arrangements have, however, sensitized Africa towards not only intra-African trade, but also global competitiveness. Some states have acquired innovativeness. Innovativeness has been awakened in the states. We have heightened gaps and vulnerabilities which have been amplified, which says to us what needs to be addressed. That is, if we talk about women, we will talk about the informal sector, we will talk about the youth. Through the AfCFTA, we need to complete the African value chain. For instance, if I may make an example of the garment industry, which one has been particularly involved in for over a long time, it's said that instead of just being 1% exporters of garments to the US, we must utilize being 1% exporter of garments that utilizes Asian fabric, which is made of African cotton. We must be looking at the cotton for and other African farmers producing cotton at the farm, delivering to fabric mills, which in turn deliver fabric to the garment manufacturers, going in through the retail chain that already exists throughout Africa. Retail distribution chain that already exists throughout Africa, so that our products land into the ultimate retail users at the end of the chain. In this particular manner, in the process, we are making availability of the value chain, value adding, and putting on more people onto the process, and also making sure that the whole process is contained in Africa. And that it is not only supplying the African market in this particular manner of the full value chain, but it is also becoming competitive to the global trade, in that time to market is reduced, and also that we have an opportunity for market diversification and product and market diversification. So these are the elements that perhaps we want to put in. And this, of course, kind of a value chain, African value chain, is what we should be looking, for instance, with our fertile soils in the agricultural produce and many other areas that we could be looking at. Hence, the question of productive capacity, investment in productive capacity comes in, because we cannot sell what we cannot produce. We perhaps want to be looking at the bilateral arrangement between and amongst African countries, primarily to deal with infrastructural impediments in order to be able to be effective in production of goods and services, and also to deal with non-tariff barriers. In innovation and utilization, which embodies tremendous potential for the services trade and involvement of youth and women under bilateral arrangements, we should have meaningful outcomes if we start first with this particular arrangements at home. It is therefore suggested that the AfCFTA should leverage the existing arrangements to the extent that they support African value chains, but be aware of their temporary nature and raison d'etre. Fresh bilateral trade agreements can only delay full implementation in at least due to the necessity of having to harmonize the tariff structures, albeit with very little progress given the limited scale of operations of individual countries in this type of arrangement. Such bilaterals would pose an element of risk also of piggybacking countries external to the CFTA, which would be looking towards piggybacking so as to take benefits of our market. Therefore, in this particular regard, one cannot but fully endorse and have full appeal to the element that has been put forward by Joy here in terms of staying this side deals so that we can have a much more determined and much more careful arrangement as to how we deal with them in the technical manner, in the technical element that she has so clearly amplified. One last element that one would like to put in this particular regard, of course, given that we are talking about navigating these issues, the question of the continuing to utilize the RECs in the process is so, but primarily one also is looking at the fact that it is all very well to talk about negotiation and negotiating terms and negotiation conditions, but the political and policy decisions by respective countries is what contribution are we making towards making sure that we have meaningful or we have capable negotiators in terms of making sure that our interests are protected in this particular regard. Of course, this starts from charity beginning at home in terms of in this specific negotiations here, are we sitting down and just taking in what people are suggesting to us in terms of what kind of arrangement, because everybody likes Africa these days and everybody is coming to us, but are we careful enough to have proper negotiating teams capacitated and negotiating amongst ourselves and interacting amongst ourselves to have that huge human resource. As we have seen this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, human resources that is capable of navigating through these negotiations and putting up packages putting up teams that would be able to negotiate our internal arrangements, our RECs arrangements, our arrangements at the forums like the WTO, the EU, and also being in a position to assist each other to make sure that whatever we come up with, we advise each other, we support each other in the context of making sure that we do not marginalize the implementation of the CFTA. COVID has shown the need for multilateralism. And this combined with the 2030 agenda, with the call of leaving no one behind, of course, is that Africa should be on the board in this particular respect. But in navigating this multilateralism, we have to ensure that it is our responsibility not to stay behind. And that says that we should be making our effort to make sure that we utilize the huge combined human resources that we have in Africa to make the AfCFTA come to a successful implementation and hence delivery and upliftment of our peoples, and that it is our responsibility in this particular respect to do so. And I thank you. I think the speaker before me has really dealt with the technical aspects of this very greatly. And let me just make this small contribution at this point. Thank you, moderator.
Thanks very much, Excellency, for that very useful contribution. You've brought in, as a practitioner, you've brought in the political element or dimension, and you've done so very forcefully. Probably just starting from the last point you've made, you are talking about the imperative for capacity building and for Africa to kind of pull together so as to support each other to be able to engage the external actors in a more constructive way, a way that would deliver goods as promised by the AfCFTA. You indicated, I mean, and reminded us of the various challenges that external engagements pose, and also the need to build on what REX have achieved. But you reminded us of political and policy-making decisions, which the countries need to lead themselves. One very interesting slogan you put on the table, the mantra of leaving no one behind, but you reminded us that it will be important for Africa not to decide to be left behind. It's a choice for the continent itself to make. Thanks so very much. At this point, I think we would give Joy a few more minutes, just so that she would react to what the discussants said. You need not be exhaustive because it was so rich. If you have to speak to every point, then we may be staying here for longer than we are supposed to be. But before I give you the floor, let me abuse my position as chair to kindly request you to see if you can engage on the implications of the most important global trade framework, the WTO, on the implementation of the AfCFTA. I don't think that particular dimension has been addressed adequately. We are aware of the fact that a majority of the AfCFTA signatories also signatories of the trade facilitation framework of the WTO, and also they are also signatories and implementers of the general agreement on trade in services. So how does this what implications has this got to do with the implementation of the AfCFTA? We are aware that all of this was factored in the negotiations, but practically, what are the implications of this? And more broadly, does the advent of the AfCFTA, for instance, strengthen Africa's position in WTO negotiations that we know are a continuing process? Is Africa in a position with the advent of the WTO, I mean, the AfCFTA, to then speak with one and a stronger voice in WTO negotiations going forward? Thanks very much. And with that, I give you the floor again, Joy.
Thank you so much, Francis. And thank you so much also to the distinguished panelists that have shared rich reflections. Annette has taken us to the practical aspects, reminding us of the challenges also with negotiating teams and taking it down to the sort of support EIF can bring. Trudy, thank you very much. It's very good to see you. Thank you very much for your reflections also on the broader perspective, because, you know, this was always about beneficial integration. You know, in the WTO, we spoke a lot in a previous slide when I worked there. We spoke a lot about the beneficial integration of Africa into the multilateral trading system. And I think the AfCFTA is really supposed to be doing that, because if trade is about the products and the services to export, then this African space should really give us that place where you strengthen those capacities. So I liked very much Trudy's point around reminding us that there's something bigger here, and that it is for Africa to reframe, to shape how that conversation should take place, also in the context of investment. Thank you very much also to Professor Babatunde Fagbaibo for your reflections. I liked very much how you went back into this idea of trade alone does not get us there. It is a means. And I like how you clothed it around human rights and around governance. In fact, ECA did a really interesting book, I believe it was, with Professor Gadi and others, talking about an ex-ante appreciation of the human rights dimension of the AfCFTA, because we often think about these things after, but I think in the AfCFTA, it really had a lot of good, in fact, I'd say best practice in terms of how to do negotiations. And that book from ECA on the ex-ante considerations of human rights in the AfCFTA, I think is a reference point, and I believe Prof. Gati is also on this call. So there's some resources there as well. Excellency, Ambassador Munyane, Nkopane, I mean, it's always a pleasure to listen to you, because I think you put it back into perspective, also enriched by the strength of your track record, also coming from industry itself in terms of textiles, and layering it with the politics of it all. So I think for me, the conversation has been rich. We have to stitch this tapestry and ask ourselves in implementation, how do we get Annette and Trudy and the Prof and Excellency Munyane, how do we get all of these ideas and put them out there into a rich body of knowledge? And I think what the AfCFTA demonstrated to us is that it's possible. It's not impossible for Africa and Africans to think through how to find solutions to these issues. So I'm very happy also, Francis, that this is not just a conversation. This is aiming at creating policy discourse and documenting it somewhere. That would be my reflections on what the colleagues and the panelists, the distinguished panelists have said. In terms of the specific questions you raise around WTO, I would not say compatibility, but I think around implications for the WTO, this was a question that preoccupied the negotiators, as I recall, very much. And indeed the advisory teams that were helping them to navigate and to interrogate and to do research and analysis on many of these questions. Let us start from the premise that everything done in the AfCFTA is envisaged as a success of the WTO, especially because the founding basis for the AfCFTA is in Article 24 of GATT, Article 5 of GATS. And we are very much guided by that thinking, not just the instruments that say you can do it, but more so a search for the flexibilities within those instruments. How are developing countries treated within Article 24? How are developing countries treated within economic integration agreements in the GATS? All of this we were trying very much to cream out those provisions so that we give light to what we mean when we say special and differential treatment. And so that is why the AfCFTA is also very much described as an expression of developmental regionalism, because in there you really try to see how can we get the best of this window that is opened in the multilateral trading system and push it forward to get an instrument that can work for Africa. Now, in practice, because I think your question was more around trade facilitation and others, my thinking is that we should use these instruments as momentum, build on the momentum anticipated in implementing the trade facilitation agreement and in implementing various aspects of WTO. Because what's good about that approach is most of the trade-related technical assistance that has been coming from the multilateral institutions has really been about know the law, know the law, know the rules, know your rights, know your obligations. So there is a core of African policymakers. When you add the WTO to the body that Annette is representing, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, to the incredible work Stephen has overseen over the years in terms of ECA's knowledge products coming out on that, and you add that to TRALAC and all these other sources, I think we're in a different place, certainly than when we were many years ago when I started to read and apply my professional time in these issues. We're in a totally different place in terms of understanding what the issues are. And so we should use that momentum. We know better. We now have an instrument that's African. We should use the momentum in the multilateral system to push further the implementation. Most of the reforms on trade facilitation you'll see in African countries are about the WTO trade facilitation agreement. The single windows, the one-stop border posts, the pre-shipment inspection, all of that is critical and relevant to an African conversation. We now have an African agreement that is premised, modeled on that template, but also more importantly, curated and contextualized into an African conversation. Many of the conversations we had, and Professor Melaku will bear me out, many of the conversations we had in those early days were about adaptability to context. And so there is enough in terms of learning from the multilateral, but also unlearning and letting go what is not working in the African context. So you have a new generation of instruments that can truly work. Use the momentum at the global, at the multilateral level to push the door even wider for implementation. Now, does it strengthen the African voice in the multilateral trading system? This is a complex one, and I wish you hadn't asked it, because I don't feel very comfortable to answer that. But I'd like to say that the politics of special and differential treatment is not unknown. We have argued for special and differential treatment based on an argumentation of weak capacities and the need to beneficially integrate into the multilateral trading system. So my advice would be that African negotiators should stand firm, dig deeper, because what the AfCFTA does is it gives you the script. It gives you clarity in terms of where Africa is going. But Africa needs the time, Africa needs the space, Africa needs targeted support to ensure that that beneficial integration is indeed actualized. And so all to end where I started, which is this idea that the AfCFTA and the WTO and all of these instruments are trade liberalizing instruments. As Ambassador Nkopane said, you can't sell what you're not producing. We must go to that space where we take a higher level of responsibility on trade-related technical assistance, trade-related capacity building in Africa to support the production side of Africa, because that is precisely what will give sharp focus. Even when you talk about standards and you talk about rules, and all these rules frameworks are a bit obscure if you don't have the made in Rwanda phone, if you don't have the made in Uganda shoes, if you don't have those sorts of products. And so I'd like very much for this conversation to also close in saying, no matter what's happening in the confluence of interactions between and amongst AfCFTA and third parties, the focus should also be very much on what are we doing for productive capacity on the continent. That clarity is important. Then we stop to theorize. Then we say, in fact, we need to defend this space because something is happening in this space. The more it remains open, the more it remains a conversation that's not down to the products and the services, the harder it is for it to land, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Joy. Thanks, the panelists, discussants. I think would acknowledge and accept that it's been indeed a very rich and engaging conversation. I see some questions on the screen, but I am afraid time is not on our side, and I don't think we can engage that. Probably I would ask the Joy and the other panelists to look at what has been posted and probably respond directly, if that is fine. I stand to be guided by Yinka, but otherwise I would want us to again applaud the panelists for a very, very rich conversation, very insightful indeed. Over to you, Yinka.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, panelists. I forgot to announce that we have interpretation in English and French. So perhaps it's not too late for people who are struggling. I saw some direct text about struggling. We have French and English. Yeah, and I want to also say that what your suggestion is correct. It is better for our experts to respond directly. Melaku has done the same. We are monitoring here. Melaku has been responding. That is probably a better way to manage our time. And thank Joy for a fantastic presentation. We will be getting in touch with every presenter, because the whole idea, as you may know, is to publish the proceedings of this fantastic webinar. So we will be asking you to to kind of develop your presentation into a publishable article. So that is it, Francis, and thank you again for moderating this in a fantastic way as we proceed to the next session, which is going to be moderated by, I think, by Charles Kahutu, who's standing by. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yep, bye.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dr. Ikome, and thank you for my former, discussants, and more so, thank you, Joy. Joy Kategekwa has actually summarized what we need in Africa in a very, very, very substantive way. Just like what Dinka has said, I think we really need to follow her advice and make sure that we actually produce as well, because AfCFTA will actually not be a reality if we are not producing what we can eventually process and eventually take to the markets. That is the essence of the entire value chain concept. Now, I'm going to moderate this session, which focuses essentially on the economic and trade arrangements with Africa by the United States and its impact on the REX and, of course, the other continental trading arrangements we have in this Eastern and Southern Africa. We have COMESA, we have a tripartite free trade agreement between EAC, ZADAC, and COMESA also. So all these arrangements, the impacts of the US economic and trade policies, let's say, with Africa, that is basically the topic. Although we also know that Africa and the US haven't got a direct free trade arrangement, as it were. What we have are actually pockets, as the Ambassador Monyane had tried to say. We have very direct bilateral bilateral arrangements, because we have actually Angola and United States, TIFA. We have COMESA and United States. EAC has signed a similar arrangement. Ghana has one. Liberia has another one. Mauritius, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda. And then both Kenya and of course the Southern African Customs Union are having discussions, an ongoing discussion with the United States to have trade and investment facilitation arrangements. Or for Kenya, in fact, they are looking at having perhaps a free trade area, which has so far not happened. I know discussions are going on, but it hasn't happened. Now, to help explore that topic, of course, we have three presenters, one presenter and two discussants. But I may just mention that I personally know that we have some arrangements that the US has put in place that directly targets Africa. All of us know about AGOA. Yeah, Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. That is one of the US-Africa arrangements that we have in place and which has been very, very beneficial to the continent. We will look to see through the discussions here whether it impacts negatively or positively on AfCFTA, which we want to promote, and other REX arrangements. In East Africa, we have the EAC Common Market Protocol. Of course, Southern Africa have their own. We have COMESA as a common market. All these things we are going to look at through our presenters, how they impact on it. We also have, of course, the USA Millennium Challenge Corporation, which actually also supports some African initiatives, mainly in a whole cross-section of ways, because that's a government corporation that targets some interventions into the continent. We'll be looking at one of our presenters to try to help us navigate what is the impact within the continent itself. Of course, we have also another initiative that was actually pushed across by President Trump, and we hope it can last, even if he's no longer the US president, the Prosper Africa program. That is again something else that in fact targets Africa, although it hasn't had its impact fully felt. I don't want actually to preempt what they are going to say, but I believe that is one other area we can look at and see whether or not it is of benefit to the continent and whether we can perhaps push it forward or move it forward with the new US administration. The moderator would like to present right now Professor James Gathie, who is our keynote presenter. Professor Gathie lectures at the Loyola University in Chicago. I know that Professor Gathie, he has done quite a bit of work, particularly on AGOA and other trading arrangements in the continent, as you heard Joy allude to. And we look forward to hearing what he has to tell us about how he thinks the US trading arrangements, economic and trade arrangements, impacts on the continent, particularly in REX, the regional economic communities, and other trading arrangements like in our case here, tripartite free trade area, EACs, common market, and so on. So I want to call upon Professor Gathie to actually guide us on this one, and then we can have some two discussants actually discuss what he has to tell us. Professor Gathie, are you there with us?
Yes, I'm here, Charles.
Yeah, okay, Professor, take over a bit, and you have 20 minutes to do this. We already actually passed our time, and in East Africa, particularly in Kenya, by 8 o'clock is curfew time. So I think I have to know, like my secretary has to be leaving me here because she doesn't want to be caught up by that. So please move
on. Thank you very much, Charles. I will take my 20 minutes and I will not take more than 20 minutes. Thanks also to the organizers for arranging this conversation and for inviting me. I've enjoyed the presentations very much. So in my presentation, I'll make the following argument that the ongoing US-Kenya FTA poses a grave threat to advancing continental integration, achieving industrial transformation, and defending and enhancing Africa's trading position in the global economy. The ongoing US-Kenya FTA negotiations, in my view, depart from Africa's long-standing goal of economic independence embedded not just in the AfCFTA, but that stretch back to the OAU and to the Abuja Treaty, among others. And we've already heard a lot about that today already. If the US-Kenya FTA succeeds and it becomes the template for US-Africa relations, the goals of defeating external economic and political domination that motivated the AfCFTA and initiatives like that will be defeated. My presentation therefore aligns very much with many of the points that Professor Melaku Desta made, as well as Joy and others, Dr. Joy Kategekwa. To support my claim, I'll give you 5 examples of how the US-Kenya FTA poses a grave threat. I'll be very specific in terms of the examples that I'll give about the threats that the US FTA poses to Africa, and I'm talking about Africa generally, not just the REX, but to the AfCFTA as well, because I see the threats that the US-Kenya FTA might pose to Kenya to be threats that will be available to other African countries that since this agreement is supposed to become the template for future US-Africa trade relations. I will also end with some recommendations. So my story is not just a story of doom, but I actually do have very practical suggestions. So my first major example of why the US-Kenya FTA poses a big threat is that the US exercises a vast amount of market power over Kenya. And unsurprisingly, bilateral deals like this between a major external trading power like the US and a country like Kenya means that there is a lot of direct and very untransparent, less public opportunities for civil society groups and others to counterbalance the pressure that a big economy like the US will impose on weaker governments to make extensive commitments that will undermine the goal of creating a single African market. To illustrate the US's market power over Kenya, if we go by 2019 GDP figures, Kenya's economy is 224.4 times smaller than the US economy. That is how much economic leverage the US is exercising over Kenya in these negotiations. Business interests in the US see bilateral deals like the one that is being negotiated as an avenue of getting unlimited access to African markets and want to use Kenya as a foothold for extending their influence in Africa. Ask me, I know this is what I've been doing for more than 2 decades, studying and teaching here in the United States. The reporting of the New York Times shows how the plastics industry is just one example of how the United States will roll back Kenya's environmental safeguards because Kenya has banned the use of plastics. The plastics industry can do this more easily than if they were negotiating with African countries as a bloc or at the sub-regional level like the East African Community. And in fact, if one looks at every year, the US releases what they call the National Trade Estimates on Foreign Trade Barriers. The Biden administration just released its own. And you go through the list of barriers for every African country, for Kenya in particular, sort of looking at that and seeing that they replicate the same wish list of US interest groups in the Kenyan market. So protections, so the idea, for example, is that the International Dairy Foods Association is saying Kenya's protectionist measures of its dairy sector limits the US dairy industry's ability to enter the Kenyan market. The Computer Technology Industry Association wants market access, customs and trade facilitation, rules of origin, government procurement, digital trade, telecommunications, and IP. And you can go on and on in that list. The US-Kenya FTA, if it comes to fruition, given what we have seen with the negotiating objectives of the United States, is going to give US corporations an unlimited geographical reach, not just to Kenya, but the whole of Africa. And they're going to be able, therefore, to increase their access to all the consumers who have been put together by the AfCFTA. They will help these corporations because these agreements impose new rules that will require Kenya and eventually African countries to open up opportunities that were only formally provided for by, for example, public corporations in areas such as postal services, courier services, telecommunications, water, electricity, and so on and so forth. And if one looks at the list of the wish list of the US in terms of the deals the US wants to make, it's not just in goods, it's not just in food and agriculture or SPS measures, it's not just TBT, it's not just customs procedures, it's not only transparency and legal issues, but also services, digital trade, IP, textile and apparel, labor, state-owned enterprises, environment, government procurement. The list is astonishing in my view. So the second major argument, these agreements will therefore present a number of distinct dangers for Kenya and for Africa eventually. And these dangers, in my view, are heightened by the fact that there's been no public consultation or participation in any sense. The only groups the Kenyan government has been interested in consulting are elite groups like the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Parliament has not been involved in any substantial way. This is not an agreement crafted based on the requirement of Kenya's constitution with public participation. It's a requirement under the Kenyan constitution, the 2010 constitution. As Dr. Joy Kategekwa mentioned, I was involved in crafting a human rights impact assessment for the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement before it came into effect. And one of the major recommendations, as she noted, was the importance of having inclusive public participation in the design of the AfCFTA, and that should count as well for purposes of the US's negotiations with Kenya. Another pillar of the 2010 Constitution of Kenya that is likely to be undermined is the right to health. The US-Kenya FTA indicates that the US would like to limit Kenya's regulatory autonomy in areas such as tobacco control, and this has been consistent in all the FTAs the US has negotiated with its trading partners. Already, the tobacco industry has failed in efforts to curb tobacco control regulations through Kenyan courts. So the US FTA is the way to circumvent that. Under the banner of good regulatory practices, the US-Kenya FTA threatens to undermine Kenya's regulatory autonomy, as we have seen with the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which is the template for negotiating the US-Kenya FTA. Therefore, for the Kenyan government to justify any additional regulatory legislation that it's going to put out in future, it has to pass through the rigorous good regulatory practices that the USMCA provides, including coming up with a justification, data and documentation in support of any rules or regulations, adopting rules for opportunities for public comment for any person or corporation from either country, adopting mandatory regulatory impact assessments for major technical regulations. You get the idea. These are really restrictive obligations that will likely undermine Kenya's regulatory autonomy. Another very good example is another barrier identified by the US in the trade estimates are the constitutional limitations on foreign land ownership. The prohibition, according to the Foreign Trade Barriers Report of the United States, the prohibition of foreigners from holding freehold land title anywhere in the country by permitting only leasehold titles of 99 years is cumbersome and opaque and should be removed. That is coming to every African country should this agreement succeed. Third, systematic policy threats to African agriculture. The US requires, when it signs trade agreements, more often than not, zeroing of agricultural tariffs. Such zeroing of tariffs would undermine Kenya's carefully crafted ceiling tariff bindings adopted in the Uruguay round at the WTO. These current bindings give Kenya a lot of policy flexibility for its agro-manufacturing plants, not to mention the big four, and one can go on and on. It's very likely that the US will target Kenya's ban on GMO maize, corn. If this is removed, we are likely to see how the same thing that happened in Mexico, where under NAFTA, 2 million farm jobs were lost as a result of cheap GMO maize from the US flooding the Mexican market. Needless to say, this is completely inconsistent with everything the current government in Nairobi is telling us their plans for agro-manufacturing and industrialization are. We need not talk about many other examples. As I've noted, there's an IP chapter being negotiated. And we already know that even the Biden administration has been very hesitant in dealing with the question of the waiver for the vaccines at the WTO. But more importantly, we know that a chapter like the one that's being recommended in the US-Kenya FTA is likely to, as I've noted, have quite detrimental effects on the public health system, not just agriculture, because many of the obligations that are likely to come with the agreement are tied to many other types of changes that we are seeing in the international financial system. For example, the IFC now has been transformed from what it was before as a fund of development and public goods to a broker of private finance that is favoring private for profit rather than, for example, public health facilities. So just another example. I don't want to belabor that point. I want to go to my fourth point, but also to mention that another of the grave dangers is investor-state dispute settlement that, in my view, would be detrimental to the regulatory autonomy of African states. Fourth, undermining continental obligation. We've really had a lot about this. I don't want to emphasize this any more than we already have had. It's a really major threat in my view. It would be better for Africa to put its house in order in terms of AfCFTA for all the reasons we've had. If we trade more in Africa, we keep more of the money in Africa rather than send it abroad by buying things that we can buy from each other within Africa. One of the Kenyan senators likes to mention how we in Kenya import toothpicks. I mean, it's quite mind-boggling, but it's really not mind-boggling if you take into account that this may be part of the kinds of obligations that we assume under trade agreements. The fifth threat, I think, that we really haven't mentioned, we have mentioned the continental preferences clause of the AfCFTA. But the other thing that we should remember about MFN obligations is that when an African country signs a trade agreement with a third country that's not a party to the AfCFTA, there's a clause, an MFN clause, that requires that any further more generous obligations that may be made between, let's say, AfCFTA partner states would also be extended to that other country. So it could be either the United States or it could be the EU. We've already seen the way in which this clause has worked in the South Pacific, forcing the South Pacific states to enter into new trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand because they gave more preferences to the European Union. So this is a really distinct threat that we should also take into account. So as I end in my last 4 minutes, what can be done? One, as Melaki already noted, I think negotiating as one bloc is really important. We know that this has been in the past, at least in the East African community, there has been this commitment to negotiating as the EAC that's now evaporating. We've already heard from Melaku as well, the idea of negotiating as a bloc within the African Union, and there's already precedent for this. So for example, the African Union Executive Council decision on Africa's strategic partnership of January 2017 had made that commitment with reference to negotiating the EPAs and with the EU. Second, what the African Union can do in terms of urging the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. First, I think that is the renewal of AGOA. AGOA should be renewed. It should be the primary objective for the African Union. Kenya has already hired not just a law firm in Washington, DC, but a lobbyist to make sure the Kenya-US FTA passes. What's the African Union doing? What's the AfCFTA Secretariat doing? This is the game that's being played in Washington right now. I think that something needs to be done. Of course, utilizing the access of AGOA, which is still the framework for US-Africa trade relations until 2025 is really important. And I agree with Dr. Joy Kategekwa's proposal of enhancing and designing the kind of capacity building that will help to meet this objective. I think that in terms of talking to Washington, African countries should pick up on the new administration's commitment to Africa. At least that's what they're telling us. Catherine Tai, the new USTR, has recently stated that we are all inextricably linked to each other and that we are sharing this planet as a home, and therefore the challenges are collective. And I think these are the types of commitments that we should urge the Biden administration to meet and not to undermine the fledgling framework of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement or even of the sub-regional regimes, as we have said. We already know that if we have to resist as Africa, we can learn from SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, several years ago. They told the US they can walk when they try to force an FTA that wasn't fit for the SACU countries. And the last thing I want to say to end on a point tying many of the other points today is that I think that the African countries should urge the Biden-Harris administration to support the development agenda of the Doha round in the WTO. South Africa has done lots of work, especially in the Trade and Development Committee of the WTO. And therefore, we have to think of other forums outside of these bilateral forums that are going to help push the agenda. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion, in particular comments by Trudy, Ms. Trudy Hatzenberg and Mr. Lars Benson.
Professor Gadi, that was a very rich kind of input. In fact, I am wondering why the government of the Republic of Kenya didn't really think of actually seeking your views before they went to negotiate this. I know the negotiators, some of them, and as you said, it has been like a gentleman's club, a close club of negotiators, and this is not good for the continent, for the region, and even for the US itself. Of course, they may have their own benefits, but really, a partnership like that one can never be sustainable. I believe so myself, that we need a partnership of equals. And when you sign a TFA or free trade agreement, it's supposed to be a kind of an acknowledgement that you are equal partners. You have something to offer, and the other country has something to offer, not really coming to beat the other one, which is basically what you have explained is actually something that I don't want to imagine what the Minister for Trade thinks when he is actually negotiating these things. Anyway, because we have 30 minutes of discussion later on in this session, I'm going to call directly our colleague from TRALAC. As you know, she has already been here, and TRALAC has done a lot of work on AfCFTA. And most of us, when we want to actually any documentation on AfCFTA, we go to their website to look at it because they are doing something every week on AfCFTA. In fact, I received some of your publications, Madam Hatzenberg, so I appreciate that. And over to you. Come and see what you can actually refute from what James has told us, because I think that is mind-boggling for now. Try to give us some clearer picture as to what you think. Thank you. Trude, are you with us?
I am. Thank you very much, Chair, for that introduction.
Thank you. You have about your 10 minutes, although you can be starting by for a review later on at the end of the session. Thank you.
Excellent.
Take on, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I'd like to thank Professor Gati for his very interesting, clear, and provocative presentation. He's raised a lot of really important issues. I would like to backtrack a little bit just to say a few words about AGOA and the fact that the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is, of course, a unilateral, non-reciprocal trade arrangement. It's not a trade agreement, so it's not a negotiated outcome. It's an offer from the United States to qualifying African countries for duty-free, quota-free market access. It extends the generalized system of preferences, and currently about 6,500 product tariff lines are on that list of market access offer. And I think that is really important to keep in mind, that this is subject to specific terms and conditions. So currently, I've just had a look at the agoa.info website, and there are currently 4 countries, African countries, which were at various times eligible for AGOA preferences, are not currently eligible. So the uncertainty around a unilateral, non-negotiated arrangement has to be factored into the equation. Extending it, I think, is extremely interesting to consider at this stage. Of course, extending market access arrangements such as AGOA are very important from not only a trade perspective, but also from an investor perspective. Investors take a much longer view of prospects, opportunities, and therefore the time frame of such arrangements are particularly important. But I do want to emphasize that we've got to keep in mind it is not a negotiated outcome. It's something that is offered to qualifying African countries, but the list of products under the GSP can change, and also countries may, as a result of various conditions that are specified in that United States Trade Act, may actually be delisted for some time until they remedy whatever the issue might have been. I think that's really important. My preference, supporting rules-based governance, is for a negotiated outcome. However, and I think here Professor Garcia has reminded us of how complex even the negotiations about the negotiations are. What should be the scope of the agreement? What should be the level of ambition? And how will that impact on our domestic national development agendas? And he's mentioned, for example, environmental impacts, agricultural, and of course, specific issues that we do encounter when it comes to including instruments on investment, investor-state dispute resolution. So these are really important issues. And let's be realistic, when we're sitting across from a giant and negotiating as a very small country, a very small player in the global trade space, then it is not an easy negotiation. He reminds us that by 2006, the Southern African Customs Union countries, South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Eswatini, had actually walked away from the negotiations. And the reason was that at that stage, we could not agree on the scope and the level of ambition. From our side, as SACU countries, the ambition was to conclude a trade and goods agreement, whereas the US was more ambitious. The aim on the US side was for a comprehensive modern free trade agreement. We were not ready for that. So I think these are lessons to be taken on board, and we've got to assess very carefully what a country like Kenya would want to achieve in terms of its negotiations with the AfCFTA. Those negotiations about the negotiations are absolutely critical. And this is where stakeholder engagement, consultation is critical. In the context of the AfCFTA, we've seen what happens when that does not take place. In the case of Nigeria in March 2018, when we were preparing for the adoption of the AfCFTA in Kigali, Rwanda, stakeholder constituencies in Nigeria informed the president that they were concerned about the impact and felt that they had not been sufficiently consulted, and therefore they did not support Nigeria signing the agreement at that time. So the practical reality has to be taken into account. But I want to say a little bit about the risks of negotiating, of Kenya negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. Kenya has, of course, just recently concluded an economic partnership agreement with the United Kingdom. And this is in the wake of Brexit. And the reason there is very clear. Kenya's exports of cut flowers and various other horticultural products are particularly important to the market of the United Kingdom. This would have been at risk if they did not do that. So here we see the practical reality of market access and the impact of that on a very important industry for Kenya was a key factor in motivating those negotiations. So again, I think we've really got to factor in the national development priorities of the African country we're talking about, or the group of African countries, vis-a-vis the trade partner that we're looking at. My issue and my concern here, and I'd like to focus on this, is taking a look at the impact on the AfCFTA on the one hand, and the impact, very importantly, on the East African community. Kenya is a member of the East African Community. It is a customs union and a common market. It is implementing a deep and very ambitious trade and further market integration agenda. Extremely important to keep that in mind. It is the only non-least developed country in that grouping. And this was one of the reasons why the UK agreement was so important, because the others have duty-free, quota-free access, as they have under the arrangement with the everything but arms with the European Union. So the fact that Kenya is not a least developed country in that configuration is important. But from a trade and goods perspective, the EAC has a common external tariff. And this is at risk if Kenya goes alone to negotiate with the United States or any other partner. Now, we understand that this issue certainly was tabled, and the way of resolving that was to say within 5 years, the other member states of the East African Community would be able to accede to the agreement with the United Kingdom, or in fact, with the US. So this becomes, for me, the big risk here. This is the factor that we've got to keep in mind. When it comes to the AfCFTA, the issue really about, as I've mentioned in the earlier session, maintaining the integrity of the AfCFTA comes down to our implementation agenda, comes down to effective implementation of the rules of origin of the AfCFTA, so that we don't have the situation that Professor Gati described, where goods from the US enter under, if a US-Kenya FTA comes about, under that free trade agreement into Kenya, and then find their way to the other state parties. So rules of origin become critical, but equally important, as I've mentioned too, is effective, secure customs and border management, transit arrangements. Those become part of the important armory of ensuring the integrity of the AfCFTA. If we do that assiduously, and we take a look at those 4 annexes to the Protocol on Trade and Goods, and we implement them effectively, we have an effective authorized economic operator agreement with mutual recognition with other AfCFTA state parties, we can secure trade under the AfCFTA and ensure that trade coming from outside the AfCFTA under preferential arrangements such as the Kenya-US agreement does not find their way into other markets of the state parties. So for me, the EAC issue is really, really important. This is a long-standing agreement. The EAC has a long history. In fact, it has 2 histories. We had the EAC phase 1, and then of course, the more recent EAC agenda, which is critically important. It is by all accounts, and if we take a lot of analysis and a lot of metrics, it is an integration arrangement that is advancing in some ways very, very successfully. There is still work to be done, no less. We should keep that in mind, but that's for me where the risk is. I'm banking on effective implementation of the AfCFTA. Then the risk to the AfCFTA's integrity can be minimized. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, Trudy. Again, another very, very impressive kind of rejoinder. And I'm assuming that we shall be getting some of these thoughts from UNECA. They have just told us that they are actually going to compile them into a booklet to be published. So we look forward to this. It is very, very rich discussion. Now, I want to introduce my last discussant in this particular session. And this is Mr. Lars Benson. Mr. Benson is known to us as a private sector. He is the director of Center for International Private Enterprise in the United States, heading the African region. The private sector is particularly interested in CPE because of its governance capacity building programs. And we work closely with Lars in trying to achieve this. As we know, most of us in the private sector, we do a lot of advocacy, lobby and advocacy work, try to collaborate with governments to unlock policies that hinder us from doing what you call sustainable businesses. And governance is one of the key areas that really is important. Even implementation of the CFTA, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, governance is an important issue. And for me, I would like to see how Lars can actually elaborate a little bit on that, see what his countries, he is from the United States, what his country's trading arrangement, economic and trading arrangement with the continent impact either positively on or negatively on the governance structure that we do have, particularly on this wonderful trading arrangement that we all love, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Lars, can you come in and try to talk to us about that?
Fantastic, Charles. Thank you. I am having some difficulty getting my video started, so forgive me if I'm not able to present in terms of show myself. Sometimes that might be a better thing than other times, but I hope everybody can hear me. So again, I'd like to thank the organizers. I definitely would like to thank Dr. James Gatti in terms of his very cautionary remarks, specifically with regards to the free trade agreement with Kenya. He's even given me, I took careful notes because he's given me quite a lot to think about. And of course, some of the comments that Trudy added to this greater discussion. Just a little bit, SIPE is at the forefront. We are part of and affiliated to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest business membership organization in the world. And it includes members in Kenya and includes members across Africa and in other countries as well. I think, I'd like to start my remarks with going back to a couple of important reminders here. If we take a look at US and Africa trade over the last 20 years, this is not a success story that we can harp about. This is something where over the past 20 years, if we talk about AGOA, I'm specifically referring to the impact of AGOA, or others, I think that has left a lot of desire from both companies in the United States and companies across Africa in terms of trying to find new ways to extend and to have greater trading arrangements between the two countries. And when we go back to what is, again, whether we're talking about free trade agreements or other negotiated agreements or the trade facilitation agreement, all of these are really pointing to the necessity of trying to create an enabling environment that gives equal opportunities and protections across, but it's under the basic premise is that trade between countries is going to raise all boats. So if we take listening to some of the cautionary tales that we've heard previously, and I'm in no way or pretend to be an expert, I would like to talk a little bit about, some of where, both responding to Dr. Gatti's comments with regards to the FTA and make some other points as well. So, if we look at the news today in terms of, we know that Blinken is going to be meeting, and it's interesting, his Africa trip, the virtual Africa trip includes both Kenya and Nigeria, and we're talking about with regards to Kenya, the news is talking about celebrating a 57-year bilateral relationship and to discuss future cooperation to promote democracy and expand trade and explore avenues to address global challenges, including climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think I take out of this a couple of things. One, that trade is clearly a priority, but also that important thing is that on sort of the first virtual African trip that Blinken is taking, the Secretary of State, it's going to be to two of the larger economy or the largest economies in Africa, which include Nigeria and Kenya. I also think that when we return to the trading relationship or the preferential trading agreement under AGOA, AGOA wasn't about just giving preferential access to the US market. There were broader objectives under AGOA, and some in the political and economic realm, like fostering regional integration. So when we see the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement corresponding to sort of a longstanding, I think, US objective and interest in Africa to foster regional integration, the benefits and advantages and conditions that integration entails, like the regulatory coherence, collaboration, infrastructure development, political engagement, and institutional strengthening that ACFA promises in terms of its implementation, really corresponds to an objective that the United States has had for decades, which is how can we increase trade between the United States and Africa, and trade and investment from Africa into the United States. If you take a look at what the motto of Prosper Africa that was referred to earlier, it seems that is what is the primary objective. When we take a look as well about some, and returning to some of the comments of Professor Gatti's right, and even Trudy, reciprocity is clearly an objective of different countries. I mean, it's exactly what I think was not really fully developed under AGOA, but you can see that in terms of the African countries' relationships with the EU, that there was definitely reciprocity arrangements made in terms of that. And so if you're 20 years after AGOA, most African countries do have preferential access to the United States, but that isn't actually what the United States has with regards to coming back to Africa. So when we take a look at really what ACFA means and what signals it sends to the Biden-Harris administration and others in the United States, I think what it's talking about under the whole premise of ACFA is the elimination of interregional trade barriers and addressing many of the key areas that the United States typically seeks in free trade agreements everywhere, which is including like questions like public access to trade information, transparent rules and regulations, customs procedures and cargo release, competition policies, intellectual property right protections, and others. And Professor Gatti mentioned a whole bunch and some of the dangers, as he called it, in terms of some of the potential impacts that this has. But we have to realize that these are negotiations that typically happen when we talk about free trade agreements. Now, I think another question that we should really ask ourselves is, where is this free trade agreement headed? And I don't really know the answer in terms of that. We know that this was initiated under the Trump administration, but we do know that the Biden administration Biden might be the first US president in over 3 decades without trade promotion authority, which is given by Congress. So what is going to be the future of the free trade agreement, I think, has a lot to be determined in US domestic politics. But that's not, that does not mean that there aren't ways in which the United States and different African countries can cooperate on trade. Countries that sign free trade agreements cannot perceive gains from the reduction in tariffs and removal of trade barriers in the movement of goods across borders remains mired in poor infrastructure, red tape, and inefficient processes. Isn't that what we've been hearing about today? I mean, that is why we have the Africa Continental Free Trade, is boosting intra-African trade. So it goes back to while we can talk about that implementation, and as we heard from some of the illustrious speakers before, we are talking that we need to address some other really challenges facing intra-African trade on the continent. And we do know that the Trade Facilitation Agreement in the world have signed this agreement in terms of the TFA, but African countries lag behind almost every other developing region in the world with regards to the implementation of the TFA commitments. So only 8 African countries have implemented more than 50% of the TFA commitments. In Latin America, by contrast, only 8 countries have not implemented more than 50% of their TFA commitments. So implementing TFA is an important way in which, when we talk about ACFA and we talk about other trade arrangements and agreements in the regional economic blocks as well, we're talking about TFA can be an important way in which African countries can realize these gains from trade. We also should recognize that the United States has provided a lot of support to African countries, both in terms of technical support as well as technical assistance in terms of some of the trade infrastructures, both physical and regulatory. And then I think one of the things we also need to talk about is clearly it's in the news right now, but sort of the opportunities that COVID-19 is going to have in terms of really beginning to address some of the supply chain efficiencies. How can we improve digital tools to support trade, e-commerce, and other areas that are not part of the free trade agreement, but definitely advances that can be supported and strengthened under ACFA. In conclusion, CIPE has going back to one of the key points about participation in CIPE and a lot of the efforts that we work on and have been working on in terms of both in Nigeria and now in Ethiopia with regards to ACFA. We've recently released a study that is quite interesting on taking a look at the informal economy and really small businesses in Nigeria. And the result of that study is telling us that we all have a long way to go in terms of better informing business, because at the end, we're talking about businesses are going to be the ones that are implementing and are the consequence of the ACFA arrangement. And if we are talking about their participation in negotiations or their participation in terms of explaining what these rules are, the study that we've recently conducted of SMEs in Nigeria indicates that we have a long way to go in terms of better educating African businesses about the potential and opportunities of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and perhaps as well, if we take a hard look at this, about the potential and opportunities of AGOA. And with regards to the negotiations, when we talk about the Kenyan Free Trade Agreement, I think that there is a long way to go before there's going to be ever a signature or an agreement with regards to that. And that is a good opportunity for us, therefore, to perhaps focus our attentions on trying to make the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement implementation a lot more effective. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you, James and Trude. Now, I think we are entering into a small session of general discussions, but before we go there, I have seen quite a bit of posts in the chat box, and there is one that is quite interesting, and I think I want both James and Trude to actually respond to it. Because it is actually something that it has a bearing on what James presented. And it says, I believe you are missing a very crucial point here. As long as a single economy in AfCFTA, which is $3 trillion US and above, does not bring much contributions to national development, these countries will look elsewhere. The question is, how can Kenya tap into the economic potential of AfCFTA to solve some of their current economic and political challenges which are on the table. The government has actually made those promises in a campaign. So he goes on to say, we need to fix Africa's financial infrastructure to move wealth faster, and we are talking policy and technical programs with no reference to financial services integration. How do we expect Kenya to refuse a $5 billion from US, Prosper Africa, in 1 year, when they cannot get even 100 million US dollars from the 3 trillion USDs in AfCFTA in 1 year? We will have to wake up to these realities very early, and once countries begin to see huge receivables from the 3 trillion AfCFTA, the region, more than any other third-party arrangement, integration will be natural. Let's fix our region financial infrastructure as soon as we can. Now, I think that was because of the not so rosy picture that James presented on the Kenya-US future FTA, and actually I believed in him, because if those facts are true, it means that in fact Kenya has gone wrong somewhere. But can somebody comment on that, because I found it quite interesting.
Let me just begin first by thanking Trudy and Lars. I agree substantially with all the points that they raised. And, I think Trudy, we're in agreement. Of course, AGOA is a unilateral program by the United States. It wasn't negotiated, but the reality is that it enjoys bipartisan support by Republicans and Democrats. And I think that African countries might waste the opportunity for the renewal in 2025 if they concede the game right now to Kenya's FTA with the United States. There were several options besides a bilateral relationship post-AGOA. And one of them, of course, was negotiating with Africa as a bloc. And I think that the political space is quite open for the continuation of AGOA. I don't want to go into lots of the debates about how the world trading system has shifted from the idea that developing countries have to trade without special and differential treatment to having to get reciprocity to reciprocity. I don't think that we should give up on that discussion. As I said, I think the other point of leverage, in my view, is in the WTO, and in particular, the very spirited campaign led by South Africa in the Trade and Development Committee, not to give up on programs like AGOA, even though they do come with lots of limitations, as some of the questions in the chat noted. Rwanda lost its AGOA preferences because it decided that its textile industry was more important than the minuscule access that it has under AGOA. So countries will have to make their choices, and I think I'm very proud of Rwanda having made that decision. Kenya made the opposite decision when it came to second-hand clothes, by the way. On this question of sort of putting Africa's finances in order, its financial house in order, I want to say two things. One is that I think we have to have historical perspective. And by that, I mean that the current trading arrangements that African countries have should not be understood as and financial arrangements with external partners should not be understood as something that started with political independence. In my view, we have to have a historical perspective that sees Africa's subordinate position in the global economy and its efforts to fight back as a really complicated one, as everybody has noted, on the trade side, but also on the finance side. And we can already see that with the question of the sovereign debt crisis that many African countries are facing at the moment. These are questions not just of domestic financial and economic governance, these are questions of the governance of the global financial architecture. And we've done a lot of work on this. If you go to our blog, afronomicslaw.org, we've sort of been doing a lot of work because we do believe that the trade issues are linked closely with the finance issues. So that's one point. I think the second point is that the debate about putting Africa's financial house in order and the incentives that countries have to look outside the continent, we can't underestimate those, but we also have to have context. Context is really important. And by that, I mean that a lot of the work that's being done on illicit financial flows from Africa shows that actually Africa is a net exporter of capital to the West and not vice versa. So I reject the idea that the only way to think about Africa's financial position in the world is to think about these incentives that African countries have, to look for the aid or the loans that are being dangled in front of them by countries like the United States. All the work that's being done on especially illicit financial flows, and the African Union has been at the center of supporting this debate with them, initially with the Mbeki report, but also subsequently with a lot of other initiatives, but also many civil society groups in Africa leading the campaign on illicit financial flows. I think that is the broader context in which we should look at this. We should reject this narrow neoliberal view that African elites who are indebting African economies and that are being attracted by these freebies that even Blinken will be, I'm sure, putting in front of African leaders, should detract us from the long-standing goals at the center of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and Africa's long-standing goals of seeking its own autonomy economically and otherwise. And so I refuse personally. I reject the idea that we should sort of think narrowly. The final point I want to make about that is we should also be very supportive of institutions like the AfrEximBank. The AfrEximBank pools resources from African central banks. It is less well known than the African Development Bank. The African Development Bank, as we know, has its own problems because its shareholders include Western governments. But the AfrEximBank is an African institution that sort of tries to rebalance the scales and to support many of the initiatives, including some of the ones that Laz talked about in terms of the informal cross-border trade, which is a really major component of African trade. We shouldn't just think about the big companies, about supporting initiatives like the simplified trade regimes like those in East Africa, supporting the fledgling non-tariff barrier reporting mechanism that's adopted by the AfCFTA. Those are really indigenous African innovations to support the kind of trade that's really relevant for Africa's ordinary people, and not just the big businesses like the ones that Trudy was mentioning with the flower industry in Kenya. I have nothing against the flower industry, but they are not the only industry in Kenya, and they shouldn't be the only ones driving Kenya-UK trade relations, but that's a story for another day. I think I have said enough, Charles, on those issues. So I hand the floor back to you.
Thank you, James. Let's have Trude actually comment a little bit on that also. Can you, Trude?
Thank you very much, Charles. And James, I support you absolutely on this last round of contributions. I think a big question, Charles, for us is to think whether our trade agendas, both at the REC level, but very importantly also the AfCFTA level, and then with any potential third parties, actually addresses the fundamental challenges we face on the African continent. And I always summarize that as saying we lack the capacity to produce tradable goods and services competitively. It addresses investment issues, productive capacity issues, competitiveness, and a whole bunch of issues that are particularly important. And that brings us to a conversation not only about financial services and infrastructure, but other services, transport, communication, professional services, movement of persons across borders, which are really, really important. It brings us to the trade facilitation agenda, facilitating cross-border trade, reducing time at the border, transit time, and eliminating those non-tariff barriers. And this is where, in the context of the AfCFTA, we have to remind ourselves that in addition to being a free trade area, it is also a flagship project of the African Union. And therefore, there are a number of complementary initiatives which will support achievement of the AfCFTA and our broader trade objectives. And they include, for example, the many initiatives that the Afreximbank is engaged in, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, the support to quality infrastructure development, quality assurance infrastructure development that it is supporting as well, but also taking a look at some of the fintech developments in the financial services sector. So for me, I think a focus on trade in goods and on tariffs in particular, as sometimes we really are bound to do, means that we're not looking at some of the other extremely important issues. So for example, we're negotiating at the moment specific commitments for the 5 priority services sectors. Financial services, one of them. What are the broad development objectives for the financial services sector on the continent that are driving that agenda? Are we looking at, for example, objectives such as financial inclusion, lowering transaction costs, supporting competition and innovation, the fintech and related developments? Or are we simply taking a look at what we've already done in, for example, our general agreement on trade and services commitments and adding a little bit there? Is it a technical exercise, or is it rooted in a deeply reflective exercise about how important the financial services sector actually is to facilitating trade, facilitating investment, and really providing the foundation for financial services inputs into all economic activity? And I think when we take a look at services such as transport and communication as well, they're inputs into the smallest enterprise as well as the largest. They're essential to improve our competitiveness, but also to assist us to create jobs and really leverage the AfCFTA and our trade agreements to address Africa's real development challenges. So I really think that, keeping in mind there is a second life of the AfCFTA as a flagship project, and there are initiatives such as AIDA supporting industrial development, PIDA infrastructure development. All of this has to come together in an overall economic development, social development partnership compact for the African continent. That's our foundation. Once we know what we need here, we can then engage effectively with partners in the global trade system and elsewhere. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Trudy. Before you leave us, I would like you to have one more comment here. There is not a question, it's a comment, but I think you need to respond to it. The distribution of benefits of AGOA and other economic partnership agreements are very limited. You said so yourself. With many LDCs, not benefiting from them. So one of the participants is curious to know where you see AfCFTA appending these existing frameworks. Can you comment a little bit on that? Because it's quite relevant, because AGOA in itself actually haven't benefited the entire continent. It's a number of countries. Yes. And EPAs are the same, more or less. Please comment.
Charles, you're absolutely right. And I think, as Lars indicated, what we see with AGOA, there are a few success stories. Some of them are in the garment industry. And then, for example, South Africa is the one country which has benefited across a number of different product subsectors, if you like, in terms of having a diversified export profile to the United States. But that's not the case across the continent. The matter of least developed countries, Charles, I'm extremely pleased you raised this, because we have to keep in mind that 33 of the world's 46 least developed countries are African. Many of them are also landlocked, so they face very specific challenges. Their tax bases are very limited, and trade taxes very often contribute quite significantly to the overall fiscal revenue of those countries. So liberalizing tariffs, as they're often asked to do in trade negotiations, puts significant pressure on the domestic development prospects and makes them incredibly vulnerable. That's, of course, being compounded as a result of the pandemic. So we've got to look at what we do to assist, in particular, the least developed countries, but take a look at the distribution of benefits. This is why trade policy currently is in a crisis. We've seen liberalization bring many millions out of poverty, but it's not done enough because of the distributional aspects. Now, a very important development that is currently underway in the AfCFTA is the adjustment facility. And this again is an initiative by AfricSimBank, where AfricSimBank has committed $1 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but if we think about the enormity of the challenge, it's a drop in the ocean. We need more contributions there. And this will be specifically for the least developed and other fragile economies on the continent that encounter challenges as they implement their commitments under the AfCFTA. This is the kind of development supporting initiatives that we need as complements to the liberalization and market integration initiatives of the AfCFTA. We need a lot more like that. Thanks very much, Charles.
Thank you, Trudy. And I want to take this opportunity to thank both James, Lars, and Trudy, of course. I will take back, I think, this opportunity to thank the organizers, NECA and other partners. I saw there was a whole lot of them. And give back, I think, the moderation to Dr. Adeyemi. Dr. Adeyemi, are you around with us? Yeah, tell us the way forward.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, colleagues, for the fantastic sessions. Session one. We are going to pause for today, and then look forward to another fantastic one for tomorrow, when we will be examining we will be examining China's economic and trade arrangements with Africa. So to be moderated by Professor Shuaib of University of Lagos, precisely of the Confucius Center. Presenter will be Ms. Sanusha Naidu, and discussants, fantastic panel, Hannah Muthoni, Bryant Morevawi, and Kibru Gena of Pachi. So tomorrow we'll be very, very busy too. We will also have a session on France trade policy, then the UK post-Brexit trade arrangement, and then section 6, trade linkages and implications for Africa, and implication for CFTA implementation. Just paying attention on India and Turkey. That would be another very interesting one. Let me thank Charles and the panelists, Trudy, James Gathy, Lars Benson, as we look forward to joining you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ika.